I know there are at least one statement over the weekend from the administration on this. I guess to begin with, in simple terms, I mean, what does the U.S. want to see happen in Syria right now? We've seen rebels advance on Aleppo. What's the policy outcome that the U.S. sees?
Sure. So in the immediate term, what we want to see are de-escalation and protection of civilians and minority groups. But our overall policy remains the same, is that we want to see a serious and credible political process to end this civil war once and for all, with a political settlement consistent with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. As you know, Sean, that resolution calls for a process facilitated by the United Nations where the Syrian regime and the opposition groups would negotiate a path forward for Syria. It's important that that path be Syrian-led and that have a process that ultimately leads towards elections. That's what we want to see over the long term, but in the short term, we want to see a de-escalation of the situation and protection of civilians.
And what policy levers does the U.S. have? I saw that the Secretary spoke with Foreign Minister Fidan yesterday. Turkey arguably has more influence than any others on these rebels. Was there a message to Turkey or to the rebels via Turkey?
So I'm not going to talk about the private diplomatic conversation that he had with Foreign Minister Fidan, but in all of our conversations with countries in the region, we continue to urge every country to use any influence it has to press for de-escalation. We don't want to see any country try and take advantage of the situation in Syria, to try to take advantage of the instability in Syria. We want to see all countries use their influence, use their leverage to push for de-escalation, protection of civilians, and ultimately a political process forward.
And for Assad, I mean, there's over the years there have been various statements on Assad's future. What's the U.S. policy? I mean, should Assad stay? Is the U.S. basically tacitly accepting that he's the least worst option?
So look, nothing has changed with respect to our policy. Assad is a brutal dictator with blood on his hands, the blood of innocent civilians inside Syria, blood of his own people on his hands. Ultimately, what we want to see is a political process forward where the Syrian people get to determine who their leaders are. As I said, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 called for such a process. The Syrian government has never participated in that process. We continue to call on them to do so. We continue to call on all countries to use their influence to push forward that kind of political process that would lead to a path forward for the Syrian people, where the regime engages with opposition groups. We also believe it would be helpful if Russia and Iran stopped their destabilizing influence inside Syria. We have seen them continue to destabilize the situation going back more than a decade now, continue to play a role that is unhelpful not just to the Syrian people, but to the broader region.
Just with on Iran in particular, I mean, obviously the Islamic Republic, this is its biggest ally, state ally in the region. I mean, does the U.S. want to have any sort of break? Does it see that as possible, a break between Assad and the Islamic Republic? And has there been any dialogue or any offers to try to further that goal?
So certainly we want to see Iran stop the destabilizing influence that it has inside Syria, because we're not talking about diplomatic relations between Syria and Iran when we talk about the nature of that relationship. We're talking about Iran continuing to fund and to arm and to back attacks on the Syrian people, something that they have done for some time, in the same way that Russia has done. So we want to see Iran's destabilizing influence in Syria and in the broader region curtailed. We don't object to diplomatic relations between countries. What we do object to is the destabilizing influence that Iran plays in Syria and across the broader region.
Yeah. Just to come back to follow up on the sanctions question, or the Assad question. In recent months, you said he's a dictator with blood on his hands, but has there been talks in recent months to potentially ease the sanctions on him as a, in a slight? Basically, your allies in the region have now have a relationship with him, so there was a sense that the U.S. position had softened slightly.
Well, let me say two things about that. One, with respect to our sanctions that we have imposed upon the Assad regime, they remain fully in effect. They have not changed. The Syrian regime has shown no change in behavior that would indicate that our sanctions should change. The second thing I'll say about that is, yes, we have seen countries in the region who are close partners in some cases with the United States normalize their relations with the Syrian regime. And if you recall, we were quite clear when those governments normalized relations with Syria that we did not think that was a productive step forward, and that countries should not normalize relations with Syria in exchange for no change in behavior by the Syrian regime. And we have seen no change in behavior by the Syrian regime, which is why we objected to those steps when they took place.
So you're saying they shouldn't have normalized relations, but now they have. Do you hope that they will push in a specific direction on Assad?
Of course, we hope that every country that has influence with the Syrian regime will push for full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, that will push for the Assad regime to actually engage with its own people, to actually engage in a dialogue and a political process with its own people, instead of continuing to engage in civil war with them.
And I think the Caesar Act sanctions have a sunset clause on December 20th. I think that's down to lawmakers to renew that, but what's the administration's position? Will you be asking for those to be renewed?
So I can't preview any steps today that we'll take with respect to Congress, but all of our sanctions, including the mandatory sanctions under the Caesar Act, remain fully in effect today.
Just to clarify, I think the previous U.S. government position on Assad had been that he has to go. You're saying, he's a dictator with blood on his hands, but you're not outright saying that he should leave.
There has been no change in our position with respect to the Syrian regime, but ultimately, we believe that this is a decision for the Syrian people to make, which is why we are calling for a Syrian-led process under the auspices of UN Security Council Resolution 2254 to determine the appropriate path forward for the Syrian government.
Now, you said that countries with influence with the Syrian regime have to use their influence and so on. What about countries with influence over Jabhat Tahrir Sham? That is really a terrorist organization. It has emerged from Jabhat al-Nusra, which is basically Al-Qaeda. So what about those countries that basically aid this rebel group that is really terrorist in nature?
As I said, we have been very clear that every country with influence with anyone in Syria should use that influence, should use that leverage to press for de-escalation of the situation.
Including Turkey?
Including every country.
Are you talking to Turkey on this in this area?
The Secretary talked to, if you looked at the readout we put out, the Secretary talked to the Foreign Minister of Turkey yesterday. And without getting into a private diplomatic conversation, I can assure you in all of our conversations with countries in the region, we are urging them to use any influence they have to press for de-escalation.
Many analysts in the area believe that Turkey, harbors a lot of ambition to basically annex Aleppo and Idlib. They already they occupy about 11% of Syria. They control probably 30% of that. So are you urging Turkey to pull out of Syria?
Now, I'm not going to get into private diplomatic conversations. Ultimately, we want to see a path forward for the Syrian people to determine the future of their country. No other country outside of Syria, no other country anywhere in the world. It is a question for the Syrian people and no one else.
On Syria, Matt, we know that you are against the Assad regime and you are against HTS, but in the past you supported the rebels, the moderate rebels. Do you support them now in their invasion or in their retaking of the territories in Syria?
So we are making clear that we want to see de-escalation of the situation. I don't think I could be any more clear about that. And ultimately, we want to see a political process forward. You were right that the organization that launched this offensive over the weekend is a terrorist organization designated as such by the United States. We certainly do not support that organization in any way, shape, or form. I know I've seen various rumors floating around, not just floating around social media, but in some cases, claims made by people who ought to have credibility that we were somehow behind this offensive. That could not be further from the truth. It is false in every way, shape, or form.
You don't support HTS, but you supported and you've been supporting other rebels who are...
There are groups that we have supported in the fight against ISIS in Syria. As you know, the United States has engaged a coalition in Syria and Iraq to to fight the growth of ISIS, and we continue to support that work to fight the growth of ISIS, to keep ISIS from reemerging as a terrorist threat. As you know, ISIS was a terrorist threat not just in the region, but ultimately a terrorist threat against the United States. It was responsible for a number of terrorist attacks inside the United States, and we are committed to seeing that ISIS continue to be contained and ultimately defeated once and for all. But when it comes to the process inside Syria and the path forward for Syria, we want to see a de-escalatory path, and we want to see a political process, or a political path forward.
Just about Syria and the sanctions. I know you've been asked this question and you gave your answers, but since on December 20, either you will renew the Caesar sanctions or not, are you open to lift the sanctions on Assad in condition to cut his relations with the Iranian? This is the question.
We have seen no change in behavior by the Assad regime. We have no indication of change in behavior by the Assad regime. Let me just answer the question broadly about all of our sanctions. None of the sanctions that we impose are ever meant to be permanent. We impose sanctions as a consequence for behavior taken by other countries, taken by other entities, taken by other actors. And we want those entities and actors to change their behavior. And anytime a country changes its behavior, we are open to changing our sanctions posture. That's not a statement about Assad. That is a statement about every actor in every country in the world on whom we have imposed sanctions. But that said, we have seen no indication that the Assad regime is prepared to change its behavior, and that is why all of our sanctions remain in place.
What if you have guarantees, some of your regional partners telling you that we can guarantee that he will cut relations with us? Are you open? I mean, this statement signals that you are open.
No. First of all, I've made very clear the statement did not signal anything. The statement was a broad statement about why we impose sanctions and why we change our sanctions. But we only change our sanctions when countries change their behavior. And we have seen a long history of the Assad regime refusing to engage in the processes outlined for it by the United Nations, and continuing to commit violence against its own people, continue to engage with the Iranian regime that supports terrorism around the region. And so because the Assad regime has not changed its behavior, we have not changed our sanctions policy. Now, if it changed its posture, I'm not even going to get into hypotheticals. We are where we are because they have not changed their posture and have shown no indication they plan to do so.
Going back to Syria, the U.S. designated terrorist group Tahrir al-Sham, they controlled almost all Aleppo city. But there are some areas like al-Sharafiyya and Sheikh Maqsood, which these areas are under control of the SDF, the U.S. partners in the region. And there are big violations against the civilians. You mentioned that the U.S. wants to protect the civilians. Even the Secretary Blinken mentioned that in his call with Minister Fidan. So are you going to take any actions to protect civilians in Syria, at least in those areas that under control of the SDF?
We are going to continue to make clear to every party and every country who engages with parties inside Syria that they need to do everything possible to protect civilians, yes.
And what are you doing? Are you going to take any action? Because
what do you mean action?
You have forces there. If these groups are going to those areas that
we have forces there to participate in the coalition against ISIS to prevent ISIS from reasserting itself inside Syria. But I can tell you that in all of our engagements inside Syria and everywhere in the world, we push every party that we engage with to do everything possible to protect civilians.
And there are tons of footage that shows the violations against people, women, and even these militants. They wear the ISIS clothes and they raise the ISIS flag and logos. So don't you see them as a future security threats on the region and the U.S. interests in the region?
I don't know what video you're referring to, so I can't comment to it. I
Thank
can't
you.
comment on it from here.